for joining us, and welcome. I'm Phil McGarry from the RNT, currently chair of this organisation, Radical Options for Scotland and Europe, ROSE for short. I was a former regional organiser for the union since 1998, and I covered Scotland since 2003, and I was privileged to be the president of the STUC in 2008. I trust everybody has received a copy of the agenda, and you'll note that the business of today's proceedings basically is in two parts. Part one on the theme of opposing Johnson's anti-democratic state, and the second part obviously is dealing with the formal business in regard to the elections. I've got an announcement to make. First of all, we regret to advise that we have had notification that Mercedes Villaba, MSP for North East, cannot now attend, and neither can George Kerrivan, former MSP for East Lothian, who got a late hospital appointment. However, I'm pleased to advise we have managed to secure two replacements with Kenny McCaskill and Ellen McFarlane, and proper introductions will follow shortly when I introduce all of the panel members. I'm suggesting that the speakers be allocated 10 to 12 minutes each, and thereafter we will have a general discussion. And in order to save some time, it would be helpful if colleagues use the chat box to ask a question and indicate to who the question is directed to, either one panel member or all panel members. And as I say, I trust you have received the agenda, the annual report on the business of the organisation, written jointly by John Foster and Vince Mills. So I'll now proceed to the panel introductions. Number one is Mick Lynch, the General Secretary of the RMT. Mick was one of the Assistant General Secretaries who was elected twice under the trade union legislation, and prior to that he served on our National Executive Committee for 2 terms. Mick stood and won the election and took up his new post on the 4th of May or thereabouts, 2021. Number two is Frida Park, an active member of our committee. Frida has written various articles for the Socialist Correspondent magazine and is active on the Scottish Cuba Solidarity Campaign and is the treasurer of the Scottish Venezuela Solidarity Campaign. Speaker number 3 is Kenny McCaskill MP. Kenny, of course, was the Justice Secretary of the SNP under Alex Salmond's leadership from 1999 to 2016. And Kenny left the SNP and joined the ALBA party and got elected at the general election representing East Lothian constituency. And finally, Ellen McFarlane. Ellen is a health worker and she sits on Unite's National Executive Committee. She was Labour's parliamentary candidate at the general election for Airdrie and Coatbridge constituency, and Ellen was part of the organising team that set up the Lee Jordan Hospital at the SECC. Ellen is an active member of the People's Assembly in Scotland. So, Mick, you're first on the agenda, and the floor is yours, brother. Please welcome Mick Lynch, the General Secretary, to address you, comrades.
Morning, everyone, and I hope you're well. I'm recovering from a little bit of a cold and whatever it is that's going around. It's not COVID, so everybody's all right this end, but there seems to be a lot of illness around at the moment, so I hope everyone's faring well. The title of the session is Opposing Johnson's Anti-Democratic State, and I certainly agree that's got to be a top priority for the Labour movement and anybody progressive in the in those circles, because what we've seen since Brexit, since it's been finally executed, is a government that is completely blind to the advantage of leaving the European Union, and I think it's done nothing to show that they've got any intentions of changing the status quo. So it's going to be up to us as a movement to bring forward those ideas. And of course, for the RMT, one of the main considerations above all else was what was called the Fourth Railway Package, which meant that constitutionally privatisation, not just there was a rail section, but many of our services, public service and utilities and infrastructure would have been constitutionally embedded into the European Union as having to be privatised and broken up and fractured, as we've seen in the UK over the last 30 or 40 years. So they've got no intention of doing that. And what we've seen from the Westminster Parliament is this white paper on the railway, where they're going to create this entity called GB Rail, which I'm sure will infuse people in Scotland and Wales and maybe some of the regions as well. They're intending to put a Union Jack all over the traditional British rail arrows, which will annoy a lot of people in London as well. I can tell you that. We're not all enthusiastic about the Union Jack being swung everywhere. And it's just another sticking plaster for privatisation. So you're going to have an infrastructure that covers Scotland, Wales and England under Network Rail's ownership. Network Rail will become GB Rail. And of course that writ is in Scotland as well, even though the Scottish government has an influence over that and is part funding it. It will still be a national network, a GB network. But then the UK, the English franchises, rather, the Westminster franchises, such as, the southern region down here, all the commuter services, but also importantly for Scotland, LNER and Avanti West Coast will be then given out by an entity that's based in London under state control, Westminster control, because that will be a public sector company. It's quite an odd hybrid for a Tory government to come up with, but rather than take the logical step of bringing the railways into full public ownership, albeit with some identity for the nations where they could run devolved or autonomous sections of the railway in Wales and Scotland, and of course in some of the big regions in England, the big city mayors would have a role, but under an integrated service. They've gone for this hybrid, which is, I don't think anybody supports, where these companies such as First Group, Abellio and all the rest of them will get these public service contracts, and in some ways they're already in place, and their palms have been loaded with gold in the latest negotiations that have been going on for the emergency measures and all the rest of it, and they're up and running now. So what we'll have in effect is private companies such as First Group, a Scottish-based company, and all these other companies, Arriva, Abellio, all the rest of them, delivering state policy, the DfT's policy, through private sector companies. And that means for railway workers, wherever they are, in every company, Network Rail and all the train operators, they will have to deliver transport austerity. And that means cuts to jobs, cuts to services and the timetables, cuts to station staff, cuts to anyone that they can get their teeth into. And the RMT is going to put up a fight in resistance to that. And in fact, I'll cover it in a minute. We're going to go on the attack in the next few weeks. Our National Executive Committee has taken a very important decision in the last few days, which I'll mention to you in a minute. But essentially, they are going to cut as much as they can and strip this down, these services, to those that are profitable and make a return for these private companies. And I'm afraid to say that in Scotland, the agenda is no different, because during discussions that Mick Hogg has been in, and even and Davey, who's one of our company council reps, and myself, in the background at national level with Transport Scotland and via them to the politicians, the agenda that is being pushed by the Scottish government at the minute, certainly on rail, is exactly the same as that being pushed by the DfT. And sometimes I wonder, who's in charge, because this Tory government isn't that ideological. I don't think they think things through. They live day to day in some ways. You can see that in the mess that's been going on in the last couple of weeks. I think it's the officials in some of these transport departments, whether it's Transport Scotland, or down in Westminster, they are completely wedded to the private operation of public services. And that's probably the same in the health departments, in some of the education departments and so forth. They're all the same thing. They all stack up to the same thing, whether it's an education academy down here, whether it's the privatisation of English NHS. I'm not as familiar as the picture up in Scotland, but the English NHS is being consumed at the minute by the private sector, not just by the high profile people such as Branson and Virgin, but these facility companies such as ISS and Mighty, which are far larger than many people imagine, are consuming and dismembering our NHS right before our eyes. And most people don't follow it. And I think no matter who the government has been over the last 25, 30 years, that policy just keeps going like moss. It just keeps coming back all the time, no matter what the heads of parties say. None of them are going away from it. They're all addicted to privatisation. They're addicted to this, even worse than that, outsourcing. So not only do you go to a private sector provider, that provider then dismembers their contract and gives it to smaller and smaller multiple providers whose sole aim and sole ability to make profit on very fine margins often is to cut the wages, get rid of the terms and conditions, get rid of the pensions, get rid of the sick pay, get rid of enhanced holiday entitlements, or whatever you can imagine. So all of the heritage terms and conditions, contracts of employment, working practices that we have inherited from our forebears over many, many years, generations, if you like, through collective agreement, through struggles, through strikes, through the accretion of agreements that's what we were used to in the trade union movement. As an official or as an activist, you wanted to leave a legacy where you'd added a bit more in your career or in your time in the movement. At the minute, what we're seeing is that being stripped away. And for me, it doesn't seem to matter who the government is. So the flavour of that down in the Welsh Assembly under a Labour administration isn't much different to what it is under the Scottish administration. And I'm afraid to say neither of those are very distinct from the Westminster administration. And it didn't make much difference when it was Brown or Blair, because in their time, of course, they dismembered London Transport, kept the franchising going, brought in the PPPs to our public services in education and health, and even the prisons and whatever, places you never imagined would be up for privatisation. And I think our job as activists, people, radicals, whatever we want to call ourselves these days, I still call myself a socialist and part of the Labour movement, we've got to bring back the arguments for public ownership. And they're not just about command and control. They're about what the values are of public service. Why do we provide the railway? Why do we provide bus services, not just in the cities, but in the rural areas, to use the term provincial towns and all the rest of it, where we've got a lot of bus members down in England? The purpose of those services is to improve people's lives, make their lives bearable, make them able to do their shopping, go and see their friends, take part in community activities. It's not just for profit. And I really think in this post-Brexit era, now that we haven't got that control from Europe, we can start to make the case for real democracy, because democracy is not just about elections, but it's actually putting power and control and budgets and decisions in people's hands, in the nations, in the regions, in the towns, and even in the villages and small communities, so that they can demand from their councils and regional authorities that they get bus services, get rail services, get care service. Of course, the Cinderella that has come to the fore in COVID. And I think it's the job of the trade unions. I'll keep going, Phil. Keep waving at me. It's the job of the trade unions to bring those arguments back. There's some signs of that, I think, in Unite. Signs of it going on in the GMB. There's a few new general secretaries around. We want to turn back to the workplace and bring these arguments out. What I want to say about the RMT, if it's how do we take on Johnson's state, well, we'll be doing that very directly. Our NEC has just decided that we're going to go on the front foot on the railway. We're going to demand the end of the pay freeze in every train operating company. That's the English train, as I call them. They do operate in Scotland, but the UK franchises, so that'll include Avanti in Scotland and LNER in Scotland. We will go for bust the pay freeze like we've done on ScotRail. We will demand no compulsory redundancies across the railway network, including Network Rail. We're going to defend our accumulated terms and conditions and working practices, and we're going to defend our pension, because we are the last of the last in having a national defined benefit final salary scheme on an industry-wide basis. So we will be putting that to a mass meeting of all our reps in the train operating companies and Network Rail in the next couple of weeks. Then we will be getting propaganda out. We will be going on the road with road shows. People like Mick Hogg will be up and down Scotland, and I'll be up and down all over the country, motivating our members to get ready for coordinated and sustained industrial action in defence of the railway itself and in defence of the right of workers to organise and to get a pay deal and to have a good standard of living and a decent set of conditions for their life, which I think is a minimum expectation. We hope that that starts a spark in every section of the labour movement, Scottish TUC, Scottish trade unions, Welsh TUC, and the British TUC. And we want to see that fight back against Johnson's state, putting power back in the hands of the workers and in the hands of our community. And I hope that everyone can join with us in that campaign, because hopefully it will be the first of a multifaceted struggle on behalf of the labour movement and all progressive people in defence of our services and of our class. So I'll leave it there, Phil. I hope your organisation goes from strength to strength and you have a good AGM and a good year's campaigning next year in sync with the RMT and the rest of the trade union movement. So thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much for a comprehensive presentation, Mick. And it's what I've come to expect from you anyway. And the question of the future strategy is very, very important in that regard, especially particularly the point you make about coordinated action throughout the whole of the country. Now, the next speaker is Frida Park. Frida, the floor is yours, sister.
Great, Phil, thanks very much. That was a tremendous conclusion to Mick's opener there, and we won't achieve anything without those kind of determined fights. So, you know, that it's really great to hear the RMT taking a lead with all of that. I want to talk mainly about the EU as such. The weaknesses in Johnson's 11th hour withdrawal agreement are really coming home to roost now, particularly just now in relation to the Northern Ireland Protocol and fishing. But, you know, other issues will emerge as well. And all of that was entirely predicted and will drag on. And it suits the interests of the Tory government and the EU, who can both be seen to be taking a tough line against each other and playing to domestic audiences. And it is a massive distraction from setting out the positive policies that Mick Lynch talked about that we could be pursuing in a post-Brexit Britain. And it also fails in the important task of moving the discussion on from the Remainer-Leave divide. And this is, I think, particularly important in Scotland, where the issue of a further independence referendum dominates politics. And the SNP makes one of its key arguments for independence that we could then rejoin the EU. So I think it is important that we move beyond the media framing of the debate as Johnson versus the EU, as this will only reinforce pro-EU sentiment in Scotland, as Johnson's hated so much. We need to concentrate again on what the EU is actually about and why it's not the socially and economically progressive force that it's often imagined to be. Further, it's difficult to square being an independent country with having to conform to EU policies. All the familiar problems of the EU haven't gone away. There continues to be a rigid adherence to neoliberalism led by Germany, and the eventual agreement to mutualise EU debt to help countries over the coronavirus pandemic may not have been the start of a new direction, but a one-off not to be repeated. The likely new Chancellor of Germany is Olaf Scholz of the Social Democratic Party, and he said that he's committed to retaining the brake on government debt, which limits deficit spending, i.e. a key pillar of kind of austerity and neoliberalism. And if Germany doesn't want to change, then there'll be no change in the EU. and it will have bigger problems without the authority of Merkel holding things together. Tensions are bound to increase, and Scholz will have a big job managing all the contradictions and conflicts in the EU and tensions beyond its borders. And of course, if Macron's re-elected in France, he'll be seeking to assert his and France's power at Germany's expense. So it won't be plain sailing in the EU. But I want to deal with a couple of specific issues which undermine the idea of the EU as a progressive force: militarisation and fortress Europe. In relation to militarisation, the voices arguing for EU strategic autonomy, as it's become known, that's to say the ability to act independently of the United States, have been given a huge boost by the US unilateral sudden withdrawal from Afghanistan and the formation of AUKUS, Australia, the UK and the US acting together to confront China. The French were absolutely enraged by that, as it involved Australia ditching its contract for French submarines in favour of US nuclear powered ones. And again, there was no notice of negotiation around that. While some EU countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, remain more pro-US, the ground has shifted in favour of those who want the EU to be able to act independently of an increasingly unreliable partner. Macron, as rotating president of the EU and the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, will convene a meeting of EU leaders next year to discuss further developments towards EU autonomous military capacity. At present, it relies on individual EU armies acting together. And this is a step on from the provisions of the Lisbon Treaty and PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. The budget for the European Defence Fund to develop military cooperation has grown from 590 million euros for 2014 to 20 to 8 billion euros from 21 to 27. And it would have been more if it hadn't been for the pandemic, so a big increase there. And there's nothing positive in this. The EU and or its member states have been enthusiastic participants in wars and military interventions. The EU has over 5,000 troops stationed abroad, mainly in Africa, and France particularly sees itself as the military leader of the bloc, and is now, of course, its only possessor of nuclear weapons of mass destruction. It retains connections and intervenes militarily, politically and economically in its former colonies in the Middle East and Africa. Within Europe itself, the militarisation of the EU will also add to the destabilisation of the continent, creating further tensions with Russia. And that also relates to the second topic that I want to raise, that of asylum seekers and refugees and the construction of Fortress Europe to keep them out. No free movement of people there. There's no EU army as yet, but the first EU militarised force has been established in the shape of Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency. It was initially set up in 2004, but now has significant funding and increasing funding. And it's been given new powers to stem migration to the EU by refugees. Its forces are deployed not only within the EU, but further afield, for example, in Albania and Montenegro, and civilian staff in Niger, Turkey, Senegal, and Serbia. The hypocrisy of von der Leyen is astonishing as she condemns Belarus and, for some reason, Russia over migration policies, especially since Belarus had no part in the wars that have brought migrants to the EU borders. But the EU very much did. So Belarus is blamed for the EU keeping migrants out. The EU's pact on migration and asylum can't be said to be anything else but an affront to decency. Von der Leyen claimed it was to establish, quote, predictable and reliable system for migration management. Meanwhile, the EU Home Affairs Commissioner, Ylva Johansson, blurted out its real intent when she said, the message is you will return. The pact will effectively destroy the right to claim asylum, forcing the refugees to return to their country of origin and in some cases to their deaths. The new system will detain refugees for 5 days in holding pens, and these prison camps will be in European soil but not be counted as European. So by this sleight of hand, the refugees will be deprived of any right to claim asylum, as they won't be deemed to have reached a foreign country. They'll be in no man's land with no recourse to appeal to any European court. The decision to deport will be made by immigration officials. The new camps will screen all refugees and deport anyone coming from a country with a high record of economic migration, regardless of a person's individual circumstances. And of course, Turkey is also being paid to warehouse refugees so that they don't reach the EU. An equally vile part of the fact is the new deportation partnerships. Countries like Poland, Hungary and Austria, who refuse to take in an EU allocated quota of refugees from Greece or Italy, will be able to pay instead for people to be deported back to their countries of origin. And an EU coordinator for deportations is to be appointed. There are increasing demands from countries on the edge of the EU for funding to erect physical barriers to prevent the entry of refugees. Though this is not yet the policy of the EU, it's been praised by Johansson. She described Lithuania's border fence as a good idea. European countries have erected 600 miles of border fencing in the last 30 years, but most of that's been since 2015. Donald Trump would be proud. Migrants are held in disgusting conditions in camps. More than 20,000 refugees have died trying to cross the Mediterranean, yet the EU countries have withdrawn search and rescue missions. In one case, a French military jets from the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle buzzed a drifting refugee boat but did nothing to help it. 61 people on board died of thirst, hunger and cold. This year has seen the Greek Coast Guard ramming overcrowded boats in distress and shooting towards them to send them back into Turkish waters. In France, Macron has destroyed migrant camps and tightened asylum laws, making deportation quicker. The same hard right policies have been adopted across the EU. Hungary's authoritarian ruler Orban said in 2016, the positions which were once condemned, despised, looked down on, and treated with contempt are becoming jointly held positions. He wasn't wrong. And this is the EU that some are keen for an independent Scotland to join. Thank you. Phil, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. As I say, thanks very much for your interesting and contribution. And I share your view as well that it is absolutely necessary and vital that we should and we will remind people of the EU capitalist organisation. And that in itself speaks volumes in relation to why we should not be queuing up for entry to the European Union. And I like to think that that's going to be the terms of asking people to vote yes or no if and when the referendum comes. And we remain interested to see if that would be granted by the Westminster government. Now, the next speaker is Kenny McCaskill, MP. And thanks very much, Kenny, for standing in. No doubt, George obviously mentioned who we are, etc. And we're pleased to welcome you to the meeting. So the floor is yours, Kenny. Over to you, bruv.
Very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. And yes, George has told me about this, and he's a man I know and have admired for a long time. I concur with the points made by Mick and Frida. I share the scepticism about the EU. There's things I enjoy in Europe, but there are other ways of accessing it, and the direction of travel is uncomfortable, as indeed it is in the UK. I want to start perhaps on the down note, about where we are, because I don't think we can underestimate the difficulties. First of all, not simply before in politics, you know, in terms of life, as many of us on this call are aware, where we learned our politics in years gone by was usually in the workplace. It was picking it up from colleagues. We had large single site employers. We had large unions. That was where people were politicised, not simply in the NUM or indeed in the RMT, but across the board. And I'm reading Ewan Gibbs's fascinating book about coal country. You know, the deindustrialisation, as we all know, has had an effect, not simply in impoverishing people, but in politicizing people. So we shouldn't underestimate that. And that has been compounded by COVID, because at the RMT demonstration, I was chatting with some Labour MSPs, and we're all accepting that people have been living in silos because of lockdown. They've been chatting to the folk they've lived with, a few broader family members. I even went out for a drink with my son on Friday night to get the second half of the football. But, you know, pubs and even places where you might have got your politics before are also not the same as they were. So there's been a shift there, the effects of which we don't know, but I think they have not been good for those of us who wish to, you know, evangelise, politicise and get the message across. And that's something we're going to have to take into account. Secondly, is UK politics, because although the Tories are now slipping in the polls, much of that can be passed to Johnson if and if they ever wish to. What worries me most is the hegemony that the Tories are managing to create within the UK, and indeed, sadly, that's been reflected in Scotland, because, you know, the Scottish government has not been particularly adept at making sure that Civic Scotland isn't simply taken over by the same forces that Mick was referring to. You know, I have to say, the brief tenure I had on the Justice Committee down in Westminster, there's almost a shamelessness. Some of it's just a change in society, but people who came before you for appointments to quangos, to NGOs, to positions of influence in civic England and Wales, and indeed the UK, previously wouldn't have had a great deal of involvement in politics. They'd have come through the sector. Some might at some stage be a politician seeking to take a new career course after an electoral retirement or defeat. But now almost everybody coming before the appointments that I was having on the Justice Committee had been a Tory MP, had been, you know, either a backer, supporter, financial or otherwise, or a candidate. They are embedding themselves in civic life. And even if we were to get a Starmer government, the fact of the matter is it would take you probably 10 years or more to root them out. And, you know, so the changes aren't simply boundary changes. They are taking control of civic society, you know, giving the jobs to their friends, not simply the contracts as we've seen in COVID. In Scotland, I think what we face more is complacency, because, you know, the position of the SNP almost reminds me, given my age and talking about watching the Scottish team and the television on Friday, it reminds me of Ali's Tartan Army. There's some within the SNP group, especially in Westminster, who simply think that, as with 1978, when all we had to do was go to Argentina and we were guaranteed to qualify, if not win the cup, then we were going to be doing darn well and get at least to the semi-finals. So we didn't do any preparation. And lo and behold, you have people who look at the opinion polls and say the SNP is winning. You know, look where we are in, you know, terms of independence, which has slipped slightly, but still a remarkable amount. But that huge complacency, we know what happened to Ali MacLeod and, you know, the offence of Argentina that's scarred on those of my generation who followed Scotland. But that same thing applies within the SNP at the moment. I tried when I was within them, pointing out that, you know, even in the Quebec second referendum of 1994, you know, up until, you know, in the 7 and 14 days out from the referendum, the Yes campaign, the Sovereignist campaign, was between 7 and 14% ahead. They lost by something like 60,000 votes. And what you have is a Westminster group of the SNP who simply think that her chief selfishness, having saved Scotland from COVID, was going to be met by a grateful population who were so impressed by how she had saved her from the 21st century equivalent of the plague, they were going to simply bow down before her and follow her to the promised land. That's beginning to unravel as we realise that basically we've been following a four-nation approach, and actually, you know, when Scotland is compared in terms of COVID with other countries, whether it's the Republic of Ireland, Denmark or Norway, we've not done as well. When you're compared with England, well, when you're up against Boris Johnson, it's not particularly hard to shine. So there are difficulties coming there. I also think there's urgency because, you know, the Tories are, you know, digging in and building in. And I have to say, I'm sceptical about the current blip in the polls. You know, I think even if it continues, then Johnson will simply be jettisoned, and what we will see is a return of, you know, Sunak or Gove or somebody else who will say it wasn't me, it was him. Exactly the same as those of us who lived through, you know, the deposition of Margaret Thatcher, the replacement of John Major, and Bob's your uncle. They win the election despite, you know, what had been done. It wasn't him. It had been that nasty woman before. Equally, it's also the case that the Tories are throwing money into North East England. Not all of North East England. There's a lot of North East England that's going to be left to rot as they have done in Merseyside. But Teesside and probably Newcastle are getting huge investment. You know, the investment going into Teesside because it's popular when the Tories and have been returning a Tory mayor is substantial. And it's a problem for the Scottish government, because people will start asking why there's, you know, jobs and all this economic boom on Teesside, but nothing's happening on Scottish coastal estuaries. The stripping of the Scottish parliamentary powers, going directly to local authorities, some of that arguably perfectly acceptable and sensible, but actually it's undermining the Scottish government and undermining their position. So I say that's the problems that we face. Equally, the biggest problem, you know, in terms of the silos is the success. And certainly I'm coming from the point of view of, you know, not just delivering the Scotland we want, but delivering the opportunity for it. The success in 2014 was delivered because we mobilised and politicised a population. People turned out to vote who had either never voted before, voted for the first time, or, you know, only voted occasionally, but we got them to the polls. And I've always agreed more with the Colin Fox scenario rather than the Angus Robertson scenario, rather than trying to convert people from no to yes. If we just tried to convert people who hadn't voted at all to yes, we would be in a better position. Because certainly we won Edinburgh East Holyrood constituency in the referendum in 2014, only marginally by about, I think, 52 to 48. But when you're polling 75% out of a 55% turnout in Craigmillar, and similarly across Gracemount, Gilmerton and other places, and yet you were getting hammered, you know, where there was an 80% turnout in Duddingston Village and other parts, the lesson is get the people out in Craigmillar and places like that, rather than concentrating and trying to persuade those who voted no in the places that voted heavily and will continue to vote heavily no. So, you know, as poverty and depression bite, as austerity comes in, we're going to see poverty that I've not lived through my lifetime. Older people will have experienced, but certainly not me. As a child of the 60s, it was always a trajectory of getting better. We've seen it getting worse. The cuts in you know, family in universal credit, we are going to feel at the same time as fuel prices are going up. What's the reason for being optimism? Well, I think, you know, I think we still have a nucleus of people, as we're seeing, you know, what RMT and the URail unions have done in mobilising in terms of getting people out shows what can be done when you do organise. All credit to them, you know, arranging demonstrations, young activists, as I marched with last week in climate change. There is a mood for activism, but we've got to mobilise it. We've got to give people hope. You know, oil and gas, you know, has moved on. Scotland has missed out. The renewables revolution is something significant, and RMT, I think, has a huge role to play there, because the opportunities for jobs in that sector. I was on getting a briefing from those involved in carbon capture and storage. The North Sea, because of its geological basin, has 30% of Europe's carbon capture potential. You know, it's more than we can store from our own carbon capture with oil and gas. We can take it from elsewhere. That is huge opportunities tied in the offshore oil and wind, with 25% of Europe's offshore wind capacity. We are not seeing it. We're not getting the offshore turbine jobs in Scotland. We're not getting the onshore benefit in East Lothian. The offshore wind benefit is coming ashore at Torness and at Cockenzie, and it's going to get cabled down to Redcar. We are not going to see any benefit in East Lothian. There's a few jobs in construction sites. That has to change. We've got to get the manufacturing infrastructure. We've got to get the benefit of hydrogen plants that can come off it, because what you need for hydrogen is water and energy. When you've got access here and the first in Scotland, then we should be moving. So that's where we've got to go. So there are opportunities. I think one of the biggest changes I've noticed actually in terms of perspective towards independence was, I remember in 2014, my friends on the left in England and Wales basically said, well, you know, Kenny, we know you're disappointed, we're sorry for you, but actually we're glad it was a no vote. These same people are now coming to me asking how the independence movement is moving, because they see it as a necessity, for catalysts for change is needed down in England. If England is going to change, and only 40% of people vote Tory in England, they are a minority, but the nature of the system there that requires some catalyst. It's not coming from revolution, it's not coming from military defeat. There has to be something, and that's why I find that the position of the English left has changed from opposition to Scottish independence to almost desiring it as they being the trigger point to see some considerable change down there. So that's where we have to go. I think, we just have to press on. I actually agreed with Mick there, and I'll end on this because I'm conscious of such speakers. If you do have control of an administration, which is the big failing of the Scottish government, civil servants will do as you wish. To be fair to civil servants, they might buck and rail, but they're effective in doing it. And if, the Scottish government on transport policy wish to be radical on rail, on maritime matters, on ferries, on other issues, they could do so. You might get senior civil servants will initially oppose, they'll do it. But I remember in 2007, when I was first appointed, led by Andrew Coyle, who was my sort of private unofficial advisor, being berated by civil servants because they supported the privatisation of the prison service, insisting that Bishop Briggs Prison, Low Moss as it now is, had to be a private prison. At which point the only juncture was for me to have to say to the then chief executive of the Scottish Prison Service, it was him or me, and we would have to go and visit with the First Minister and the Permanent Secretary because this wasn't on. To be fair, they backed down. I think the Scottish Prison Service now recognise that rolling back privatisation as best we couldn't roll back Addywell. But a lot of this is about will. So I agree with what Mick's saying there. There's a culture in civil service that accepts it. But if the political powers go in and say, this is what you're going to do, exactly the same as I've no doubt mandarins in 1945, exactly the same as Bevan had to, stuff the GP's mouths with gold or whatever it was, we had to fight off senior civil servants who were telling me it was wrong, and I could not say that private prisons were more expensive than the state sector. That was said, you cannot say that. Nobody would now dispute that they are more expensive, not just in the damage to the individuals. So it's about getting political control. That has to be about agitation, mobilisation. It has to be about getting unions into where our new economy is coming from, which is in renewables. And it has to get active in our housing schemes, because if we don't get back to doing in 2014, where places in Clydebank, even my own patch in Pearsall Square, east and west, that are poor, deprived areas, where people were politically active, politically aware, and the SNP's been dining out on that shamelessly, despite their failure to deliver for them. Unless we get back into those areas, the poverty that's coming in this winter, the bleak hardship, will see them simply switching off. Because the final point I'll conclude on, I've never been one of those people that support the independence cause and believe that the worse it will get, the better it will get for the independence cause. If that was the case, the worse it got for blacks in America, the more the position put forward by Martin Luther King would have, increased in credibility and support. The fact of the matter is, the worse it gets for people in deprived areas, the worse it gets. It doesn't transform. It's hope that raises political opportunity and that drives people forward. So we've got to deliver that. So that's my offering. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, Kenny. Again, an interesting contribution, and you covered a lot of ground there. Just to make the point, my personal view is that the Scottish people obviously have got the right to determine their own future, but under what terms? And I've mentioned this before. If the terms are still the same, queuing up to get back into Europe, then that should be resisted for all the right reasons. I mean, Jim Sillars, the vice president, once said that, and I quote, he couldn't understand why, he could understand why we should be leaving the capitalist club in Westminster, but to queue up to join the biggest capitalist club in Europe seems to me and seems to him to be senseless. And that sums it up, in my view, in relation to that particular issue about Europe. But again, thanks very much for standing in. Contributions was excellent, and I now want to move on to our final speaker, Ellen McFarlane. Ellen, the floor is yours, sister, and great to see you.
Thanks, Phil. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to you. So I think as Phil said at the start, I represent Scotland on Unite's National Executive Council. I'm an NHS worker and a former Labour Party candidate for Westminster in Adrian Shott's constituency. And yeah, I'm a campaigner. I'm a campaigner, really. I guess the theme is about anti-capitalism, really. So whether that's People's Assembly, the People Before Profit movement, Airdrie Greenbelt campaigning against multinational developers trying to come in, a whole range of different things. I also worked briefly as a civil servant at Scottish Government, and that's interesting, just picking up comments from both Mick and Kenny, that I was asked to provide some feedback about an amendment that was being asked of a piece of legislation that was going through Scottish Parliament at the moment. I gave a really good evidence-based information back for the minister about why they should be accepting these changes to the law. And what I got back was, no, what the minister was asking for was reasons why they can reject these. Can you rewrite your advice? So I think you're right in terms of, you know, the theory that the civil servant is there to be independent and to give professional advice, which was essentially why I was deployed at the government for a year covering maternity leave for someone. My experience was exactly the same as what's been described earlier on. It was, even if you had some independent voice there, what ministers were looking for was echo chamber and wanting their own information to be upheld. So why are we active in all these things? Why, you know, what are we doing here on a Saturday morning? Do you often wonder, what do normal people do on a Saturday morning? I certainly do. But, you know, we could sum it up, couldn't we? We want change. We want a different world. We want a different Scotland. We want a different Europe. And we want to challenge Johnson's anti-democratic state. So I guess my contribution really was going to be talking about within Unite, my experience within Unite, and Sharon Graham, who has recently been elected as the new General Secretary in Unite. So I was kind of a late arrival to her campaign team. She was standing on a manifesto and a programme of change that she was seeing that change was needed within Unite as well. But once Beckett got into bed with the Turner camp, that was me gone from Turner. So I enthusiastically got involved with Sharon's campaign, read the manifesto, and was quickly impressed at the energy and the commitment of the people involved in Sharon Graham's campaign. So her manifesto, she wrote a manifesto with 8,000 words, separated into 6 different parts. And her main piece is about unions need to get back to doing what it says on the tin. That's her main summary, really, of what her campaign for change is. So it's not massively radical in some ways, but it's quite exciting at the same way. So in terms of the industrial and the equalities, what she is talking about is creating combines within Unite. And what she's done is she's looked at the industrial makeup of Unite and looked at the main sectors across the economy of UK, Scotland and beyond. And is saying, if we get together the top 10 companies, the stewards that are the lead stewards in each of those top 10 companies, and get those stewards together to meet and prioritize and say, what is the top issue in your sector? And can we create a Unite agenda that says, this is the policy that we're going to then try and drive through all of those top 10 companies. That way, we in the union become the pace setter in terms of terms, conditions, pay, and we start mobilizing and helping people realize the effectiveness of the unions that the unions can have in terms of making those differences. Whether it's equalities, her line is similar. So in terms of equalities, what she's suggesting is if we can get the top 10 employers who employ disabled people, or the top 10 employers who employ women or employ Black, Asian, ethnic minority people, bring those top 10 stewards together and from an equalities point of view, say what is the main issue? What are the key areas? What are the key policies that are needed that we can start driving through and see to get equalities at the bargaining table, rather than being a side issue that a lot of trade unions have had equalities committees for many a year, but that real impact in the bargaining table and having those impacts. Her manifesto also spoke about the Democracy Commission, about how can we remove barriers for engagement in the trade union movement. You know, we've got too many individuals hogging too many positions. So a union like ours, which is massive, we're missing out on the benefit that comes with being such a massive union is about all that talent to tap into, but the same individuals get re-elected onto their regional committees, their national committees, their equalities committees, etc., etc. So a democracy commission is part of her agenda as well. She had a particular part in a manifesto looking at Scotland, Wales, Gibraltar, Ireland, Channel Islands, Isle of Man, some of the other areas that Unite also organises in, and about further development and listening to what the members are in those areas and what their needs are. And she also had a focus on retired members and community, and how we can be much more visible as leaders within our communities as well. And all of this I see as quite exciting ways of how we do fight that Johnson's anti-democratic society. As far as the political is concerned, I think she has been misunderstood, maybe deliberately, in being positioned, certainly during the election campaign, as not having a political piece within her manifesto, which is not true, and it's not what I've seen. But what she is saying is that the political drive and the political policy for Unite must also come from those same industrial inequalities combines. So bringing those combines together and saying, you know, if it's finance, for example, taking those top 10 companies within finance companies, what is our policy demands, but also politically, what laws do we need changed? What is the priority from a political point of view? From transport, if it is renationalisation of bringing transport back under public control, absolutely, that's what she's expecting to hear when she brings those transport members together, and that's the kind of campaign that would then form our political approach as Unite. What she is saying is there is no political saviour. The Jeremy Corbyn project and the hope that we all had, you know, motivating me to stand as a candidate, as we've already mentioned, it's gone. We've instead, what have we got? An 80+ Tory majority at Westminster. And in Sharon's words, she can't point to a single MP or MSP for that matter who has saved one job, who has increased pay or improved the conditions of actual union members. That is our job as a trade union movement. So whether we're in Europe or out, and whether we're out but not in the type of Europe that we would have been voting for, whether we're in the UK or out of the UK, those same issues remain. And certainly my experience in Adrian Shotts was a hugely challenging one in terms of, you know, what difference really can we make to the lives of people? And it is about the role of the trade unions to collectivise, to educate, to inspire confidence, to take on fights, to fight back and to win. And they're the ways that we're going to reposition the trade union movement as being relevant for that rebuilding of our communities and for taking on Johnson and others like him. So things like fire and rehire, things like the massive mental health dropout issues across our society, pay freezes and cutting back on pay. So one of the first things that Sharon Graham did day 2 that she was elected, she asked for a list of what are all the active disputes currently within Unite, and she wanted to meet with the shop stewards. And she was told, I don't think we've got that list. So something that even as fundamental as that, how far wrong have we gone as our union movement? That seemed to be a radical thing that she did in day 1 of being elected. And by Friday of that week, what she had done was organise a Zoom call with the senior stewards and the regional officers for each of those disputes on one call, giving her personal commitment and making sure that rather than go to the Labour Party conference, she was on the picket lines of every single one of those disputes. And that meant that the political backdrop of that in terms of the media reports, she was able to name Weetabix and name a whole range of those different disputes that weren't getting any media attention. But that single act of saying that she needs to be back doing what members have elected her to do and being on those picket lines got some of those struggles into the more mainstream media. So in that hostile Westminster government, where we've got those where we've got these different disputes, that's where putting together, for example, as Sharon has already done, an interim national disputes team, which has got forensic economy analysts within it, it's got campaign comms experts within it, it's got industrial animals within it, to do the whole piece of how do we expose the terrible and blatant stuff that all of us can see, but how do we expose the way that Tory friends and family have all been given, you know, multi-million contracts for things, and, you know, how do we motivate and explain and educate, and through our trade union movement where we can do that. Labour, if we're waiting on a political response, Labour is obviously very ineffective just now. In Scotland, the SNP, the fantasy that it's just if we can be independent as Scotland, then everything's going to be all right, appears to be their answer to everything. So our energy, coming back to that question at the start, where we spend our time, where we put our energy, we need to be putting our energy into where we can make real change. And I feel really strongly that the public sector, and I really support and echo Mick and the RMT's forthcoming plans, that I really see that the public sector is where we've got some trade union density still across Scotland and in the rest of the UK. And therefore, it's not a surprise to me that the Tories have targeted, in the same way that they absolutely took on our steel industry, our mining industry. That was also about taking on our trade union movement. And that's where I see the battleground have moved to. It's moved to public sector, whether that's transport, whether that's health service, where my background is, whether it's education. And I can see the Tories taking it on ideologically as taking on the trade union movement as well. So we need to win, and we need to work really hard together across our different trade unions. And I know that Sharon has already met with Mick, or in terms of trying to work together on that, those campaignings where Unite isn't the lead union in those key economy sectors within the UK, then Sharon is absolutely determined that we make sure we work really strongly with the likes of RMT in terms of leading on that transport piece to really make a difference and fight back against that Johnson anti-democratic and capitalist environment that we're working in. So thanks again for the opportunity to come and join you this morning. Phil, you're frozen.
You know what's happened? Oh, that's it. Thanks very much. Unmute yourself, Ellen. All right, sorry. Can you hear me?
I hear you loud and clear. Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much for your interesting and detailed presentation, especially in particular giving us an insight into, if you like, the reorganisation or the planned reorganisation of your union. And that in itself is a formidable challenge, and we wish you well in your endeavours. Again, thanks very much, Ellen, for standing in at the last minute. And I personally wish to thank you for all of the support and help you have gave me throughout the activity that I've been involved in. It's been greatly appreciated. The other thing that I want now to do is to open it up for, if you like, brief contributions and questions. I've looked at the chat box, and Mick Hogg, first of all, wrote a statement, and obviously the General Secretary has indeed replied, so it's not necessary to go over that. I take it, Mick, you're quite happy with the reply from the General Secretary. If not, you've got to use the internal structures to do so. There's Andrew Ferguson. Question for Kenny. Can you talk about Alba's position on the EU, and will Alba campaign against the EU? Perhaps you would like to answer that point, please, Kenny, if you don't mind.
Our position on the EU is that it will be for the people of Scotland, probably in a referendum, if discussions ever take place between Scotland and the EU at a future referendum, but that is some considerable way down the line. Alba will decide its own position closer to the time. Our current scepticism is that the SNP position on EU membership is frankly insane. Leaving aside whether you wish to be there or not, the position is it would take you a minimum of 3 years, probably more like 5 years, to be able to get back in. We require to give the people of Scotland an opportunity to decide what they want to do in their country, not 3 or 5 years down the line, but immediately. That's why our position has been that what we have to do is to seek to join EFTA and the European Economic Area. We can see good reason for doing that. First of all, the political views, it doesn't tie you in with the iniquities that Frida was correctly saying, and I concur with, because I'm very much of the Varoufakis sort of line on the EU. But the fact of the matter is you can get EFTA and EE membership, within a matter of weeks, if not months. And that is where we go. It gives you the opportunity because, life has changed post-Brexit and the SNP policy hasn't changed with it. I have mentioned Jim Siller's attack upon the EU. Equally, I was there when Jim and I actually were protagonists for independence within the EU. But I think the EU has changed as an institution, certainly with the arrival of a lot of the Central European states and how big business has taken over. But also, more importantly, Brexit has transformed matters. Britain is now out with. And the idea, as the SNP are going to try and discuss at their conference, that they're going to have a frictionless border between Scotland and the EU and England and the rest of UK is out, is frankly insanity. It's just not feasible or possible, as we're seeing in the situation, which is even exceptional in Northern Ireland. So our position in a nutshell, Andrew, is we are out of the EU and that's where we stay. The best opportunity for Scotland is to be an independent nation, but striking a deal to get into EFTA and the EA that will give us access to the single market. That's what Norway does. It's what Switzerland, Iceland equally do. That also, and most importantly, allows us to strike a trade deal with the rest of the UK, which could not be done if we were an EU member. And it's in Scotland's interest to ensure that there is a trade deal with the rest of the UK. We won't be in Schengen because we can have the single, the common travel agreement that applies with Ireland, but equally we can have a trade agreement that will allow trade, which is necessary. When you represent East Lothian, the number of lorries that go up and down the A1 is significant, and therefore a trade deal between an independent Scotland and the rest of the UK is vital, and that needs to be struck by an independent Scotland able to do that, not requiring to accept the EU's hard border. Where that will peak the EU, my position, Andrew, is I think we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. We would take steps. I would be for the Scottish Government to decide whether to negotiate for EU membership, but it would have to go to the people. My view would be, I think I'll take a rain check as what the EU is likely to be like in 5 years' time. And I have to say, I don't think it's going to be even as I don't think it's necessarily going to be a halfway ship. Everything that Vida is saying, I think there's internal problems coming with the demise of Merkel. And indeed, some of the attitudes in the central and eastern areas of Europe are going to undermine it. So that's a position. EU, EFTA, and strike a trade deal with the rest of the UK.
Thanks, Kenny. Thanks very much. Now, looking at the chat box here. Oh, that's okay, fine. Now, is there anybody else want to make a contribution, ask questions or whatever? I don't see any hands up as yet.
Oh, could I just ask Kenny a brief question in relation to the Scotland's railway in terms of a report that was launched last month? Would the Alba Party put their weight behind the Scotland's railway report that was launched outside the Scottish Parliament and following the recent demonstrations outside the First Minister's residence and Glasgow Queen Street recently, asking for support and the vision for Scotland's railway? What Kenny's thoughts and views are?
Happy to subscribe. I was at the demonstration outside Bute House. First time I'd been Bute House since I'd been going in as the minister. So it was quite interesting. But I didn't get in, I was just outside. So no, we're happy to endorse that. I've been in touch obviously with Gordon Martin and with others, both on ferries but also on rail. I know RMT's position and I fully respect and understand how you refuse to subscribe to the Sun. Equally, I have to say, sometimes I take the view you've got to get the message across. So you don't have to buy it, but you'll be glad to know that there's a big splash at the day as I've compared and contrasted Edinburgh, London with Barcelona, Madrid, and Glasgow, London with Seville, Madrid, and taking the point that as people jet out on their jets from COP26, it might have been better if they could have got on a high-speed train, which you would have done if you lived in Spain and had been taking place in Barcelona or Seville, not being obliged to fly out. So I'll accept your condemnation of me for using the columns of the Sun. Equally, I take the view that you've got to get the message out there, and they were happy to splash it big time. So yes, we're on board for that.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, Kenny, for your Alba's endorsement. That's very helpful indeed. Okay, Mike. No, anybody else? Nobody else? Time is it? It's 12:10. We've got the formal boring business next. John, are you? I don't know whether Vince is still with us or not, or he's been unable to connect. But John, do you want to introduce the report to the AGM delegates? And for the speakers, you're welcome to stay if you so wish. But we're going to be dealing with the boring business and try and finish up well before 1 o'clock. John, I think it's important if you briefly mention the activity that we've been involved in over the last 12 months. It would be helpful for those people who have joined us who are interested in what we do. Okay, John.
Yes, I'll come in. This is a report jointly written with Vince Mills and myself, and I think it reflects hopefully the opinions of the committee as it worked over the last 12 months, which have been very interesting, very challenging, where we've done a lot of work around the Scottish elections 2 or 3 months ago, or slightly longer than that. We have been campaigning effectively to raise awareness of what Johnson is doing. And I think we've heard this from Kenny, we've heard it from Mick. It's quite dangerous to simply see him as a buffoon. He and his closest associates do have a plan. It is very much about privatization. It is very much about attacking the remaining bases of democratic union strength. And it is also about centralizing power, coming out of the EU, grabbing all the powers that neoliberal control that were there, putting them into British legislation, and then using that to create a new, very close alliance between government and the biggest of private companies and consortia, and using that in a new way to penetrate down directly into local communities and societies. And the points, I think it was, I can't remember who it made, probably Kenny, talking about the way in which people in charge of quangos were being very much recruited from the ranks of the Tories. So what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the subsidies control bill going through is an attempt to deprive the Welsh and Scottish parliaments of the powers they got in 1998. The procurement bill also likely to go through this session, white paper form already. That will effectively kill community wealth building in terms of democratic powers by local authorities. And we're instead seeing big business taking large amounts of money from central government to plonk down major enterprises doing new things, but doing them with money from government in Teesside, Merseyside, and indeed in Scotland. And that is going to, for Johnson and his colleagues, going to reconfigure politics. That's the challenge that we face. And it's one that we've got to get awareness of. That's the challenge. How do we respond to this? Well, first of all, we have to, as Frida did, explain the big business and anti-democratic character of the EU, because I suspect there might be at some stage an attempt, both from within some sections of big business and some sections of the Tory party and large sections of the Labour Party, as well as the SNP for that matter, and the Greens, because back if the Johnson project collapses, that the prosper, major economic crisis, we may see that push. And we have to both get an understanding of what the EU is and also get an understanding that, in fact, Johnson is just putting into British law all the neoliberal restrictions on democracy that already exist in the EU. So focus in particular on current Westminster legislation and the degree to which that is eroding any form of democratic economic intervention. Scotland, Wales, with their own separate legislature currently, and also any potential intervention in the regions of England. So this, I think, is the second challenge that we've got. And then the third is how we actually link to the mass campaigns. There are mass campaigns out there beginning to develop, and I think Helen's done an excellent job in describing some of them, but the demand for the public control of transport, trains, but also buses, the demand for a halt to privatization of the NHS, taking social care back into public ownership, the issue of energy, shameless ripping off of energy by private companies, all controlled from outside Britain by big consortia that are taking money from the government to put in carbon control, but will not do it on the terms of ordinary people, communications, and the similar control of all the private communications. This is something that we have to plug into and try and take into that these broader themes that we've heard about from Kenny, from Helen, and from Nick. Very, very well. That's what we have to do. We have been, to some extent, fairly imaginative in developing new forms of social media. It's still at a very early stage. That's what we have to do. That's what Vince basically wrote most of it. Wants us to and carry forward in the new year more effectively than we have in the last year. I mean, Phil, you may want to elaborate that a little bit yourself, or other people you might want to do that. Marooned in London and it doesn't have connectivity again, so it's something about the complete failure of the communications.
Okay, John, not to worry, but thanks very much for your oral report and indeed your written report. If anybody hasn't actually received it, then by all means let us know and we can ping a copy to you. We have got an awful lot of a formidable challenge, I think is the phrase, from today and throughout the whole of next year, especially and particularly the things that the speakers have alluded to. And I think that is very, very important as a consequence. I go back to the point, as the terms of the referendum to queue up to get into Europe, then that remains to be seen. And if that is the case, I think that will put us in a position of opposition. Can I, first of all, thank the speakers for their contribution. They've all been very, very interesting and helpful. It would be remiss of me not to say to those who are still left that if your branch or your regional committee has not decided to affiliate or be a supporter, then that would be welcome. Just let us know and we'll send you the appropriate information. We have three main unions, Unite, Unison, and my own union, the RMT. We've got supporters from the CWU and the Bakers Union and the majority of the trades councils in Scotland. But the more the merrier, And anybody who has zoomed in today are more than welcome to join the committee, because the more people involved who can spread the word, the better it would be regarding any campaign initiatives. Now, I'm going to, if you like, call on the Treasurer, Jim McDade, if he's on the Zoom, to give the Treasurer's report. I can't, oh yeah, there you go, Jim. Thanks
Phil.
for the written report, mate, but if you just want to supplement how we are financially, we've been very, very prudent, no spending the money.
No.
And you'll be pleased as a Treasurer.
Well, you've took the words out of my mouth, really. I don't know if John can share the report for those who maybe haven't seen it. Are you able to do that, John?
Not,
As you put,
I don't think so. Apologies for that, but I'm working on a different computer. and-
I know you did send it out by email. There's not a lot to see there. We've actually went a full year since our last AGM under COVID restrictions, so there's been, the only meetings we've had have been online, and as a consequence, our only expense, certainly the only expense that I've had to deal with was as a consequence of the change of the account name, which we eventually get done this year, and that was just a £5 bank charge. Our affiliations have dropped, again, possibly as a consequence of the fact that all our meetings are online. But overall, you know, we're still in the black, which is the main thing. So, as I say, I'm hoping people can see or have seen the report. I'll take any questions at that.
I think the report was circulated, Jim. So thanks for that. Any questions to the Treasurer? Anybody? No? Great stuff. Thanks, Jim. Don't see anybody with any hands up or anything of that nature. Right. Last but not least, okay. I'm now going to proceed to the election of the officers for the next 12 months. And it's prudent, obviously, for me to stand down as the chair and ask for nominations for the chair of the organisation. Can I have nominations, please?
I'll nominate our current chair.
Phil McGarry.
Okay.
Seconded.
Was that a second? Was that a second? You might be sorry and regret you put forward the nomination, guys. I mentioned at the last committee meeting, I think it would be prudent if we decided to elect or appoint a vice chair, and that has been approved by committee members. So I'm asking for nominations for a vice chair, please.
Would Arthur West be willing to stand?
Arthur, are you up for it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'm happy to do it. I mean, obviously, I won't be offended if anybody else wants to do it, but I'm happy to stand.
Any other nominations then? No? Okay. Arthur, you've been elected as vice chair, and thanks for the interest shown in that regard. Now, as far as the secretaries are concerned, we have obviously joint secretaries, both Vince Mill and John Foster, and I'm seeking nominations for the status quo in the first instance.
Yeah,
Anybody?
I'll nominate both of them as continuing.
Thanks very much, Frida. Is there any other nominations? No other nominations? John and Vince are duly elected as the joint secretaries. And finally, Treasurer. Nominations for Treasurer, come on.
Jim McDade.
Thank you. Seconder.
Yeah, second.
Thank you. Any other nominations? No, okay. Andrew, I see you've got your hand up. You want to say something? Unmute yourself, mate.
No, I was just seconding the appointment.
Oh, okay, fair enough. Right, fine. Well, basically that concludes the business. I'm just asking you.
One more officer, Phil. I think we need a minute secretary.
Oh, of course, beg your pardon. Well, you wrote the agenda, John. Minute secretary, of course, Robert, I'm sorry. Permission. Are you prepared to take on the job? Can I have a nomination for Robert, please? Yes.
I'll nominate Robert.
Thank you. Right, fine. Now then, as I said, that's you again, the minute secretary. You do a great job there, Robert, especially and particularly getting the minutes out very quickly after we have our regular meetings. Do we need a meeting, a normal committee meeting before Christmas or not?
I think we probably do, Phil.
Do you want to put something in the diary then?
Yeah.
Or you want to? Because a few committee members.
Second Monday in December. Would that be any good for people? Usually
Second.
About 5:30. I think that's the 14th.
14th of December.
Monday 14th, is that right?
No, 13th of December, Monday. Yes.
5:30.
Tuesday. The 14th. Are we all agreed on that?
13th. Monday 13th.
Monday the 13th. 5:30. Yes? 5:30.
Yes, right.
Okay, that's grand, that's in the diary. Well, again, it's worthwhile for the record just to thank the speakers for their contributions. Kenny in the chat said he's happy to be here today and he's happy to keep in touch and help out as best as he can. So that would be prudent in my view to put Kenny on the email list, John, in future. And as I say, the speakers' contributions were excellent. There's a lot to think about. I understand that the proceedings has been videoed, and there might be probably a piece in the Morning Star on Monday, as I understand it. So we look forward to that. All I want to say finally is this. Yes, the challenges facing us, the activity, from the RMT is to be welcome, and it's what's expected because I've been a member of the RMT for over 40 years and we pride ourselves being a campaigning union. It's very, very interesting that the reorganisation proposals are indeed under discussion as far as Unite is concerned. There's dialogue and discussion between the General Secretaries to coordinate all that type of action. Frida's contribution in relation to the future is very helpful as well, and I thank Frida for that. So at the end of the day, I've enjoyed actually the AGM. I've enjoyed listening to the speakers. As usual, I took copious notes, but what I want to do is now sign off the meeting. Thank you all for attendance. Thank those who zoomed in. Thank the speakers, and I wish you well in what you do for the rest of the day. Thanks very much for your attendance, comrades. Great.
Wait tonight, then Phil.
Yeah?
I'll get the minutes to you late tonight.
Oh, great stuff. Okay, fine. Thanks very much then. Cheers.
Well, thanks to the chair.
Thank you, comrade.
Thanks, comrade. Catch you later, guys.
Cheers. Bye.